it would be nice to report that the focus adjustment, the adjustment of the film plane went very, very smoothly, but it didn't. I had problems with the bottom right hand corner. I couldn't get it to come up, and what it turned out was that the washers underneath the front of the camera had become dislodged. It was only had one of the three at that corner. The other two had fallen back into the body out of the way, where they almost certainly would have caused problems later if I hadn't noticed. But so I took the front plate back off, set everything again, and we're back where we started. Everything's running smoothly. That body appears to all work well at this stage. Next, what do I want to do next on here? I won't do the leatherettes yet. I'm going to leave them till last. I need to clean the viewfinder assembly and reassemble that to the camera. That's assuming it needs to be done. I expect it does. Most of them do. Before I put the cleaned viewfinder assembly back on the camera body, I want to put the front control rings back in place. Bring that back to the B position. Make sure that my meter dial there at the top is where I'd expect it to be. Here's the shutter speed scale, and I'm just going to lubricate that with some molybdenum paste. Just this section here where that notch is. That's where it couples with the shutter speed ring here. When this reaches the end of its travel, that actually drops out and runs in that body there. You see it drops back in to connect up again. That's so that you can move the dials over effectively beyond the B position in order to use a smaller aperture. Okay, so that's sitting there neatly in place. And here's this assembly. These parts I've cleaned carefully with Naphtha. The front ring I'm putting on here, this is the aperture scale ring. I'm going to hook it onto that spring, stretch it out slightly, and then the tab drops into the slot here. I'm checking to see if that runs smoothly on there. There's a bit of a hint of roughness there, so I'm going to put a bit of graphite powder in there and work it and then blow the graphite powder out. Let's check that that spring's seated and try it again. Yeah, still a hint of roughness. I think that's the easiest way to put it. All this stuff needs to move quite smoothly. So I'll just drop a bit of graphite powder in there. And then I'll work that front ring. So that the graphite powder settles between the two components and lubricates the contacting surfaces. That feels good. I'll go and blow that excess powder away. That moves smoothly now. I'm just going to run some molybdenum paste around these surfaces here on this brass ring where it contacts the other components. And I'm not leaving much on there, I can tell you. There were a couple of patches on the brass ring here where there was some light corrosion. I don't know whether the camera got splashed at some stage. when you get very isolated spots of corrosion, it usually means that something was splashed. When you've got very general light corrosion, it's usually a sign that something was stored somewhere damp. Okay, so that moves nicely, that's all sitting there correctly. And you should line this up. Zoom you in a bit. So that this cutout, the end of this cutout here in the brass, comes up to that slot there in the aluminium. And that's the point it goes back on the camera. Set to B, and with the shutter speed set to B and the aperture set to f1.9. Now this is the ring that opens the diaphragm. I'm just going to run some molybdenum paste around the outside and inside edges. Just a very light wipe on those surfaces. That sits in here like that. And the third tooth on this ring should line up with the pinion, with the groove in the pinion. There'll be a small space between the tab and the end of the slot over here. That's ready to lift onto the front of the camera. And all I have to do is get this in place without disturbing anything, which of course is not easy. I've just noticed something. I just need to check on something here. Now this setting knob here is cracked. It's cracked through there in line with that screw hole. I'll remove it and I'll either glue it or I'll see if I can find a replacement. Yeah, it's certainly apart. There it is. I'm looking at the state of that, trying to decide whether that's been glued before, which is certainly a possibility. You'd have to go to a lot of trouble to get to that part. I think that will glue up, so I'm going to clean that and glue that with some super glue and do the screw back up tight. Okay, that's as good as new. Now to get this in place, hopefully without disturbing anything in the process. That's not sitting down correctly. What's going wrong here? Let's have another go. There's more than one way to skin a cat. Get this in position. B, f1.9. Those components lined up. We'll put the ring in here. And I'll try again. I'll lift the whole lot into place. And it all depends on how easily that couples with the shutter speed ring. Now this looks like it's out one tooth to me. Yeah, that just dropped into place. That all looks good. The long screw goes down there and the two shorter screws go in the other two positions. It often takes 2 or 3 attempts to get the front rings seated correctly on the shutter, so don't be surprised if it doesn't go well the first time you try it. And it's just a matter of taking your time, patience, just checking that all appears to be seated. Does the focus, the shutter speed ring move the shutter speeds? It appears to. This has moved. We've moved at least one stop there, so something's out. Just I can tell because this is not lined up correctly with the front of the camera where I had it. So we'll have to have another go at that. It's important that the mechanism is correctly positioned, that the timing is correct, otherwise you will find that you can reach the end of your cord before the mechanical components have reached the end of their travel, in which case the cord will break when you force it past the end of its travel. If everything's correctly placed, that can't happen. I'll turn that wheel to get that back where that should be. So that is pointing to the front of the camera, not further over. That's set to B. I'll get my front rings correctly oriented again. It should be B and f1.9 at that point. Those dials, the shutter speed and the aperture counter rotate. So we're trying to line up the shutter speed dial, the aperture dial, and this notch here at the end of that travel of that brass ring. And I'm half a stop out there by the looks of it. That's it there. And our dial, our ring for opening the diaphragm blades. Offer this up to the camera, see if it'll wriggle into position. It has, but I'm out there, I'm at least one tooth out there. I have to have another go. Okay, everything dropped into place. This is in the correct alignment. Everything feels good. Mind you, I said that the first time round. I'll get my 3 screws in. Check that the shutter speed dial indeed sets the shutter speeds correctly. And that the action will complete. Okay, the shutter speeds. They work. and the dials will counter rotate right through their entire range from a 500th at F22 through to 250 seconds at f1.9. Oh, that's B at f1.9, isn't it? Yeah. Okay, that feels quite good. I'll tighten my 3 screws up. Now, if you've managed to damage either of the 2 short screws, those chrome screws when you've been handling the slip with a screwdriver or something, put the ugliest screw in the top position and then put a daub of red paint on it afterwards. It makes it easier to line up your lens when you're putting it back, because the existing red dot's quite small and fairly hard to see, and it covers up. If you've damaged a screw head, that's the ideal way to deal with it. Okay, so that's our rings on the front of the shutter. And you can see if we set the shutter speed, and as we move the wheel on the bottom here, we're changing the aperture and we're moving our meter setting. So at this point we'd be moving the wheel, we'd be aligning our meter needle, and that would be selecting the aperture for us at that shutter speed. And if you wanted to change the shutter speed, you'd change it to something else. That would counter rotate the aperture setting to keep your exposure the same. Right, now it's ready to have that prism put back in place. This viewfinder assembly has the problems that are quite common to the Retina Reflex models. Lots and lots of tiny speckles visible on the focus screen. Now they are mildew spots, and they form between the plastic window you see here and the ground glass which is behind it. Of course, the only way to clean them off is to dismantle everything, which is lots of fun and games. So this viewfinder assembly here, I'm going to start taking it apart. Be very cautious of this window, this plastic window at the bottom. It scratches incredibly easily. If you put it down on something, you'll scratch it. If you wipe at it with glass cleaner, you'll scratch it. It just is very easy to scratch. So I'm just going to remove these 2 screws from this clamp down plate. I'm wiggling this to see what's going to come loose. The plastic frame and the shim have come adrift from the bottom. Now there's a piece of foam rubber stuck here. Now that's almost certainly gone hard and crusty and it's useless. You can get rid of that. I want this bracket off because I need to part all this black tape. I'll remove that single screw from the mask at the back there. Just peeling off this tape. I'm peeling off the prism. That's come off complete. Now I need this bracket off here really because I've got to put the prism back. I've got to put the tape round it, and I can't put the tape round it with that bracket in place. I'll leave that for the moment. That's quite well stuck. Let's have a look at this. There's some tape here. This is to keep dust out. All this tape is to keep dust out of the finder. It doesn't really serve much other purpose. Inevitably the adhesive's given up with old age, so it's going to fall off anyway. Now there's a clip here that holds the condenser lens in place. Now there'll be 2 or perhaps 3 clips. 1, 2 in this case. They're sprung into place. We have a condenser lens. That's glass. We have a spacer. We have another lens, glass lens. We have this frame that spaces that out. And below that we've got our ground glass screen, and the plastic screen is below that again. Now those speckles, the speckles are more obvious there. You can certainly see them. There are 6 small screws around here which hold that plastic frame in place. They'll be all locked in turn they're locked with a bit of lacquer. They'll probably come loose anyway. I usually back them off a good turn, half a turn, 1 turn. They also serve to adjust the position of the plastic screen. The plastic screen's got the rangefinder image on it, the split image, and you need that to fall in the nice neat hole in the middle of the ground glass. These screws are tiny. If you unscrew them completely, they're not easy to put back, but they are easy to lose, so you have to watch them at all times. That screw just pushed right through, so it must have been right at the end of its travel there. See if I can get it to back out. No, it's been pushed right through. Okay. There's our plastic screen, and on the inside of that, that's where all those mildew spots are. This, I found the only practical way to clean this is suspended in the ultrasonic cleaner. The ground glass screen, by comparison, that'll have mildew spots on it too. Same surface as what was involved in the other one. That can be cleaned with a glass cleaner. There's nothing particularly unusual about that. That's glass. Glass is easy to deal with typically. Plastics are a nightmare. So easily scratched. Okay. So I'll put all those components to one side, particularly the optical ones. I've got to start cleaning things up. And the main thing to clean up is this. There's that screw that dropped out. I don't know whether that's stripped out in that hole or it was just driven right through. I'll see if I can get it to screw in. I really don't want to lose it. Oh, with a magnetised screwdriver. Okay, no, it does thread in. That's okay. Right, so this case, I've got to clean all that old adhesive and rubbish off there, which means using acetone. Of course, I've got to keep the acetone away from anything that vaguely looks like plastic, otherwise the plastic will be a nasty translucent rather than transparent mess. Acetone does a great job of getting rid of this old adhesive. Yeah, these reflex finders, as you saw, there are a lot of optical components stacked one on top of another. Inevitably, there'll be some dust that's going to get into the finder somewhere, particularly when you're working on it, trying to reassemble it, and that dust will cause you grief. I'm sure when they put them all together they had a nice a clean room with probably filtered air and all sorts of things. That's not how I live. So keeping the dust out of them is very, very difficult. It's not unusual to get the whole finder completely reassembled, only to see that there's a speck of dust somewhere in the middle of the finder offending you. And you have to take the whole thing apart again to blow it away. Life would be much easier if the finder was open at one end so that you could blow any dust particles out the other end and then seal it back up, but that's not how things are organised. I think the moral of the story is that if your viewfinder has got one or two little dust specks in it, leave it alone. Don't go in chasing them. The chances are by the time you're finished you'd be very pleased if you only had one or two dust specks. By that stage you've probably got 20 dust specks and you've damaged something in the process. Spots in the finder do not reproduce on the film. We all like things to be new and shiny, but unfortunately it's very, very hard to achieve, particularly with something that's 60-something years old and for which there are no new parts. It's not uncommon for the prisms in these retina reflex cameras for the silvering to be failing. Now that might be quite general, it might be all over the prism. You might find that the prism looks dark and that there are big shadowy patches. Or it may be that you see a couple of dark spots and they are where the that plate, that clamp over the top of the prism, that can be where that is. There are two small rubberized pads either side. Underneath that pad they press onto the prism either directly, or there's a foil tape on top of the prism and they press onto that. Now those pressure points, it's not uncommon for the silvering to fail at that point. Why should it fail at that point? I would suggest that it has to do with, there's one or two options there. It's either the adhesive or the chemical properties of those rubber pads. They may, or indeed the adhesive on that aluminium tape, that may react with the coating on the prism and cause the coating to fail, or cause the coating to interact with the silver and cause that to fail. And the alternative that I've thought of is it'll be to do with thermal expansion and contraction, and where you have two surfaces bound together and they expand and contract at different rates as the temperature changes, you probably create a bit of a shear force there, and that may be enough to cause the silvering to fail? I don't know what the answer is, and to tell the truth, it's probably wouldn't repay my efforts to spend the time finding out, since the answer is always the same. If the product has failed, search for another one. Knowing how to make something last another 60 years isn't much use to me at this stage. Okay, so I've got that nice and clean. I've got rid of all my tape, and that housing's ready to go back together. I've got to look at this prism. I've got to take that bracket off that prism without losing my silvering. Otherwise I'm going to have to put a new prism on there. The replacement prisms are available still, strangely enough, but it's all money, and the owner of this is already spending enough money, so they may not be enthusiastic to spend more. Alright, that lifted off, so the rubber pad's lifted off the aluminium foil tape, and on this side one of them's lifted off the tape, and the other one, the bracket's lifted off the rubber pad. Okay, that was a good result. Now I can remove this tape. And I have to remove the tape because I've got to replace it with some good tape that would actually stick and do the job of keeping the dust out. I'm looking at the state of my prism now. Now there's one dull spot, and it's under that pad. But apart from that, the prism looks good, and that's probably not enough to cause an issue in the finder, so I'm pleased to see that. Right, my first problem now, the first component I need to clean is this plastic piece that has the split image in it for the focus, the rangefinder focus. And to clean this, I'm going to suspend it in the ultrasonic cleaner. I've got a clamp somewhere which will hold that up so that the surface doesn't come in contact with anything physical. This is what I'll use. It's just a clip. The spring's been modified so it hasn't got as much oomph as it once had. And I just put it in there like that. Now I've got that prism side down, and I'll just put that in the ultrasonic cleaner in some hot soapy water. That's just normal dishwashing liquid, and give it a couple of minutes. Never give it much, 3 minutes is plenty. Run it under the hot tap to rinse it off, blow all the moisture and droplets off it, and dry it carefully with a hairdryer on low, and that should bring it back as clean as I'm likely to get it, and I won't have had to touch that surface with anything. Not a cotton bud, nothing. Well, I'm just back from the ultrasonic cleaner, and as you can see, that window is sparkly and clean. No sign of those nasty specks. That is the most delicate component, and that's the one I need to get back into the case first. Now, the prism on here, it's got a prism on one surface. That surface goes upwards in here. The plane surface goes to the base here. If you put it in the wrong way up, you're going to end up with trouble, because you won't have your ground glass and your prism indicating focus at the same point.